All right, so if we take a look at the prompt itself and what we were asked, you notice the construction is similar to what we have seen on every question so far this year. First question gives you just, hey, here's what you're looking at. They specifically point out that we're looking at a contemporary poet, so we know that it's a 20th century piece, but more so, we're looking at it as much more current. Important more than anything with that, just because a trick that we've seen as teachers is that when they give you a more contemporary piece, students assume there's no depth in it because they understand every word of it. It's almost as though older constructions lend in your mind to, oh, well, this is a complex text. Versus if we give you something that you can read everything with, because you can understand, process, and comprehend it, you don't see it as complex at all. Second one gives you to read the poem carefully, your duh statement. Then they give you your charge. Write a well-developed essay in which you analyze how, so that should have caught your attention. We've got to be focused on how. The poet conveys the complex relationship of the father and the son through the use of literary devices. And here they list, remember that on our test, they will not list. They will simply ask how and expect you to be able to do this. So we need to be focused on two things as we discuss the poem. One, how the meaning is created, not what the meaning is. And second, this complex construction. And we have talked about this through the year in terms of how do we address complexity? What is it that they want to see? So as we start to look at the poem, tell me some of the things that stood out to you.
There's like shifts to where the father is looking or like imagining into the future.
Mm-hmm. So the shifts in time. Now, if you look at how they prompted you in the actual prompt, they do point out point of view. Does the point of view change? When they make those shifts in time, do we all of a sudden get the perspective changed from someone else? Or is it still that third person perspective?
There is a shift where it becomes, it's saying like that, are you a god? Oh, that's dialogue, so no, there shouldn't be.
No, there's not. You're perfect. That's you said it exactly the way I was hoping. Some people perceived that the point of view shifted here. They weren't able to just recognize it as time. So in their conversation, they couldn't figure out what he was doing. And what their essay ended up creating was this situation where you're like, oh man, we've got to see comprehend. You don't even get that part. Like we need to look at how he's talking about the complex thing. You can't even understand how he's writing it. So for sure, you saw it. Good. So we see him use these shifts in time. We're going to come back to how this creates meaning in a moment. What else do you notice?
The father has difficulty, like, I guess connecting with his son, or like he tries to, he wants to, but he has difficulty coming up with the correct words for the story.
Okay, so we see this back and forth with the father where he wants to please the son, but for whatever reason just can't. How do we see the poet build that in?
Do you mean like examples in the movie?
Yes, please.
Well, so in the third stanza, in a room full of books, in a world of stories, he can recall not one, and soon he thinks the boy will give up on his father.
Okay, so we have that whole set of lines that kind of sets up the situation here. And so when we're looking, what about that builds this idea other than that's what this literally is. Because remember, our task here is how, and you're right, it's there, but we need to be able to express how it's there and how the poet builds it, rather than just giving these lines that literally say what we did. Okay, so first, what's he trying to do? Don't overthink it. What's he trying to do?
He's trying to recite a story for his son.
Bingo. Look at the first bit of what you said. Look at where he's sitting.
And I love it. Library type.
Yeah, in a room full of books. What is that an example of? Bingo. So notice here, this should be as simple as get up and get a book and go. But the ironic thing is he can't. Now, part of that is frustrated. If you look up, the boy asks for a new story, seemingly as though dad has exhausted the stories that surround him and he wants something new. But beyond that, just look at the irony of the situation here. Anything else that we have in the poem that develops this idea of the father's desires versus the reality of what we're facing?
After the shift in the thought and in time,
Yes.
the son is leaving and there's dialogue that says, "Don't go, hear the alligator story, the angel story," like going through all the past stories he's given or decided for his son.
So here again, all of a sudden he can come up with stories when the son is leaving. Seemingly, we could wonder if these are old stories. Again, the dad has been asked for a new one because he does say, you love that one. But here again, how is this constructed? All of a sudden I can come up with stories. Once again, we're highlighting this irony. That in this moment, now I can. But when you're 5, when you're looking at me, I got nothing. What did you do with the rhetorical questions at the bottom? How many of you just didn't even know what to do with them? And you were just like, Okay. Both rhetorical questions frame a metaphor, right? Where one of them, in one situation it's the father, in the other situation is the son, is elevated to the role of a god, right? Ultimately, if you are someone that believes in a god, what do you want to do for that god?
In religion, you wouldn't do anything.
Yeah. You'll do anything. You want to please them. But in reality, do we sometimes fall short? So notice how we bring that idea in through these rhetorical questions. So when it's the father as God, he said, well, let's look at the son as God first. He says, "Are you a God that I sit mute before you?" Well, that in your presence, you're all as so incredible. I can't say anything. I want to. My desires are there, but the reality just doesn't let me. And then he flips it. Am I a God that I should never disappoint? If you've asked me for something, if I'm a God, I should give it to you. These rhetorical questions are an example of a hyperbole. It's a gross over-exaggeration. Neither one is a God. Neither one deserves this kind of elevation. But we do it because we slowly, as we move through the poem, if you take a look, is this a major life-changing kind of issue that we have?
Not the original, but when there's a time jump, the moving out is.
The original problem is not a big deal. Kid asks for a story. If you can't come up with one, is it the end of the world? No. But notice what the dad does. As each stanza progresses, the problem becomes more and more. He creates this anxiety in his head. of not being able to fulfill this one simple request, what will happen? And notice it goes from, oh my God, he'll turn away, to, oh my God, now he's a God and I have to fluster for words. This expansion, this hyperbole that continues, it helps to highlight the reality of it. And I gave you the word, but still kind of works here. This anxiety of the father. Notice how it's undercut as we get towards the last stanza. As he keeps imagining this to be more and more and more, we're reminded in that last stanza as we return to reality. But the boy is here. He's still a boy. He's still 5. Don't worry about what he's going to do when he goes to college. He's 5. Focus now. What'd you do with like line 20 and 21, as well as the rest of it?
At the end, if I did finish my essay checking,
It's okay.
I would have used it to, I guess, hit home that there's a difficulty between both to truly understand and connect, and there's an anxiety that goes along with that.
Okay, let me stop you for a second. Is it on both sides?
Not exactly, no. But when I was going through it, I did, I think, maybe talk about how the son, while packing, did not respond at all to the father's request, but again, that was his innermost thoughts, and so why would he respond?
And consider too, is this real? When we have these time jumps,
Yeah.
are we actually traveling to the future and seeing what's going to happen? No, the father looks ahead. So imagine the way that you construct your own future, the way that your anxiety is going to heighten this, where as much as you beg and you plead, you get no response from the son. So let's look at those last 4 lines, because he says it's an emotional rather than a logical equation. So all of a sudden, we're kind of changing the game by using the word equation. Logical equations seem to dictate what? There's a correct answer. If it's an equation, what do we have 2 sides of? Like, what goes in the middle between the 2 sides? An equal sign. So by bringing in that word, we're seemingly saying that we should be able to balance this if it was logical. Is anything emotional have anything to do with balancing 2 sides? No. So let's solve the problem. If this was presented logically, what would this equation look like? So the boy asked for what? If this was logical, Dad would do what?
Read the story, tell the story.
Or even if you wanted to look at it, boy asks her story, Dad has story equals happy because Dad tells the boy the story. That's logical, right? But this is emotional. These things aren't going to balance. They're not going to make sense. So if we look at what he says in the last couple of lines, a boy's supplications, the ask, hey, tell me a story, and a father's love, his desires for his son. I love you. I want to provide for you. I want to do this. Add up to silence. So here in the emotional, this is the same. Now, I'm pretty sure I can say this about all of you in this room. None of you have a child. So when you look at this, all of a sudden you're like, I have to talk about a father and son relationship. I don't have any kind of basis for that. We're also not going to presume that you have a dad, because I've made that mistake plenty of times where I say, we all have that relationship. And the whole class is like, oh, I have a dad. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm a terrible person. I'm not going to go there. But we have all been in some kind of a relationship with someone. I don't care if it's a parent, an aunt or uncle, a grandparent, someone you're dating, whatever. You want something, or they ask you for something. Ultimately, for whatever is here, whether it's dad, whether it's you, whatever, you want to please that person if you love them. We do. Does it always work? No. Do you always know what to say? Do sometimes you not say anything and you make the situation worse because you get so worried about saying the wrong thing that you choose to say nothing? Notice how this whole thing works. Boy asks his dad for something simple. Tell me a story. Dad comes up with nothing because he gets overwhelmed by his anxiety and his fears. He's worried about saying the wrong thing, not coming up with a story, failing his son. Oh my God, now you're like a god and I can't even speak. I'm in awe of you. Ugh. It is why this is a earthly, they say, rather than a heavenly equation. If it was heavenly, everything would work out perfectly. But here on earth, nothing does. How many of you are starting to see how this poem works a little bit better? Okay, we haven't hit on some of the other things that are present here. What's he call his dad? Baba. Do we know anything about the poet?
I mean, based on the name, you could guess that they are of Asian descent.
Okay, based on the name, we could probably guess that they're of Asian descent. So he's actually Chinese, but do you know that based on what you're seeing? Not necessarily. Have you ever heard someone call their parent Baba? Does it matter if you've never heard it? Does it sound cute? Does it sound loving? Let's go with that. So what we don't want to do is write in the essay, oh, Baba must be Chinese for father. Let's not turn this into like an issue of making assumptions about different cultures that we have no idea about. Let's not go there. But instead, look at the diction choice. Here, he could have gone with anything for dad. And instead, he picks kind of a cutesy name that seems a little more individual to the relationship to define it. Like, anybody have like a different name they call their grandparents? That's usually the one that we can talk about and see that connection. Like we get grandma, grandpa, nana, different things like that. Anybody have one that's really different that they feel like it's like nobody else uses this one?
I call my grandma Nina.
Nina? You know, grandparents have this great moment when the kid is born where they get to make up whatever kind of name they want. And a lot of times it also gets determined by what does the kid say? Because you might want to be this, but if the kids start saying this, a lot of times grandparents are like, all right, fine, that's what I am. I don't know. But think about how that moment gives that opportunity to develop a relationship. When we look at that choice, that diction choice of Baba, think about how it communicates and builds that connection between father and son and lets us heighten this whole desire versus reality thing. It lets the hyperbole make sense because the father is so invested. He doesn't, the son looks at him so lovingly. Baba. It heightens these things. So notice that's a choice that we can bring into how. What'd you do with the first two lines of the poem? Anybody? Okay, so look at the choice of what the first word of this whole thing is. Is that a tone word? Does it help us to define the tone of the poem and how we're supposed to feel about the father? Heck yeah. So look at that. Then also look at the way that it's like constructed here. It's almost like a maxim or a proverb. It seems to speak universally rather than just individually to this one situation. Sad is the man who's asked for a story and can't come up with one. It seems to speak that it's like we can look at this situation and be like, oh, but by presenting it in such a universal way in that first two lines, it's almost like the universe is condemning him rather than just, oh, just me. Dang. Look at, anybody do anything with the title? Okay, so the title of the poem is a story. The central issue is that the father can't come up with a story. But what do you notice about the poem? It's a story. So once again, we can come back to irony. Had the father just told his son, once there was a dad who couldn't come up with a story for his son who wanted one. Has he fulfilled what his son wants? Yeah, he solved the problem, but he's so caught up in his own anxious fears, he can't see past it. Let's take a moment to start to process and look at your response a little bit. And the first place we want to look is your thesis statement. In the thesis statement that you produced, remember that our prompt asks that you talk about this relationship as complex. This is where you evaluate on your own. It is February. We did this at the end of January. We've talked about complexity for 6 months. We've talked about thesis statements for plenty of time. Did you include a complex statement, or did you just tell me the relationship is complex? If we're still struggling to follow the basic instructions of what I have basically told you, hey, this is how we find success, it's on you, and you need to be aware of that. It's not me. Most of you that are watching this at home, you're not even here. You never even met me. Too bad for you. But when we look, if I'm telling you, hey, this is the way we got to do it, if you're still not doing it, you don't deserve to pass the test. And that's not me being nasty as much as it is. Here's the minimum bar. So we want to look when we're writing our thesis statement at 3 things. Every time we're writing that thesis, we should have a subject. What's the poem? Who's the poet? We should have an assertion. And here, that assertion has to be framed as the complexity. And then this is the one that almost universally we're all failing at, and we're going to miss the opportunity to elevate that score, is how does this play into a theme? So let's take a moment. Now that we better understand, I want you to brainstorm. What is a complex phrase that you could write to describe this relationship? We can write it with a blank yet blank concept, but it doesn't have to be in that structure. When we're talking about it being complex, we should show that it has multiple facets or sides. So think about words that we could use to describe this relationship. Give me some.
Loving yet distant.
Even if you just have one word, give me the one word that you have. You gave me yours, you're good. Look at the father. What are words you would use to describe the father?
Insecure.
Say it again.
Insecure.
Insecure. How about stressed? How about strained? How about worried? If we wanted to go beyond it, to kind of bring in some of the ideas that we talked about, we could bring in something like idolizing, yet disappointing. Because if you want to show that idea of multifaceted and seemingly complex, if you idolize somebody, why would you then disappoint them? We can even go a statement that's seemingly simple, and say that the relationship is simple yet complicated. He even presents it that this relationship should be simple. The answer to this question should be basic. I just tell you a story. But for some reason, I got nothing. How many times, think about your own relationships with your parents, your mentors, the people that matter. How many times do you hope that they would open their mouth and just say something basic to you and they say nothing? Sometimes it's easy to judge that relationship and go like, I just want you to say this one thing to me, where for that other person, it might be the last thing they think about. So we've got some words we can use. Your task is really to look at how can you display your understanding of this. And I want to kind of transition to looking at some samples. On today's Canvas page, I gave you multiple links. I want you to look at the first link that's there for samples. And when you click it, you're going to get a PDF document that has a lot of stuff as a part of it. But we want to find the one, it should say at the top, Notes for Rangefinders Set 1, L through R. Everybody got that one? The first few pages are the explication of why they scored what they scored. Now, this is on the old rubric, so they're scored 0 to 9. What's nice about these documents is normally College Board gives us 3 samples. Here, I can give you 10 samples, 1 for each scoring point. So we really can see how scores progress and get better if we go bottom up, or how they continue to degrade. I want to give you some time to read sample L. So if you go down, it starts on page 5. You'll notice at the top right, it says L1. This is the best sample that we have in this set. I want you to read it, and I just want you to think about how did this student show their understanding of how the poet constructed the complex meaning. Bless you. chance to read it?
I forgot my notebook.
Okay, no problem. Okay, just for the sake of time, let's kind of move into discussing this one. First, looking at their thesis, do you notice how they have a complex construction in there? What is it?
I think they say it's talk about like it being unique. They've been saying seemingly fear and disappointment. So there's like a unique aspect, but it's tainted with fear and disappointment.
Yeah, I think even it hasn't yet in there. Like if you look before there, it's like something yet fear.
He desires to be admired by joy yet fear.
And even there, you're seeing that bit where you're like, oh, he put that together. Remember, this is a student who took this with no prior knowledge of the poem and produced this essay in 40 minutes. We do have to keep that in mind when we're looking. If you look at their first paragraph, it's a great way that we can look at how to use this piece of evidence to discuss irony, but we make the irony the focus of it, not summary, which is where a lot of people fell in. They wanted to point to, hey, he's in a room full of books. And you hoped that it would either make the connection itself or your commentary in and of itself was just like using that quote to set the stage and move on in a summative way. But here with this one, you notice how he's able to use his evidence to connect to how, using that to then build where we see that meaning. Second paragraph really does a good job as well of talking about that how construction. How do these pieces here link up to these central ideas? Now, this is top of the line. This would be the student who would probably be walking away from this essay with a 6 on our test. What we want to do is to maybe use some of these other samples that are here that are higher scored to give us an idea of what does this good writing look like. If I would kind of drill you to where should we be looking for where we are right now, I would look at sample Q and sample N. On the old test, sample N would be basically like you barely passed. Sample Q would be, okay, you did good. You'd probably be in line to get a 3 on the test as a whole. When you look at sample Q, you will notice that, they struggle to get the words together for complexity, but as you read their essay, you still get a clear idea that this student knows what they're talking about. They might be struggling, but they get it. This is indicative of that 3 score on our rubric, where we would look at it and go, your commentary connects to some of your points, but not to all. When you're looking at sample N, N has that example of, I'm going to point at irony with this line, but I'm not actually going to explain it. I'm just going to say it's ironic. So we go, okay, you kind of get it, but if you can't explain it, we're not going to give you credit for it. That's more indicative of a 2. So if we're looking, Q and N best show what we're doing right now versus L is going to point you towards where do we really need to go as we move forward. Tomorrow, we're going to be writing about Hamlet. So prep yourself. It's going to be a question 3. We want to see some of these things that we've talked about coming through.